So in this segment, we're going to be discussing former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney taking a victory lap, saying Brexit is to blame for inflation. Mark Carney has blamed stubbornly high inflation in Britain on Brexit, claiming he had warned the public that leaving the EU would damage the economy. The former governor of the Bank of England said they'd been vindicated over predicting Brexit would lead to higher prices, a weaker pound, and slower growth. And I mean, for me personally, I will not take a victory lap but maybe he should. He warned us at the time. We basically hounded him out, moaning at him, saying he wouldn't understand us because he's Canadian, he's foreign, he doesn't get what British people are about or English people. And to be honest, he probably couldn't understand why we'd do economic seppuku. But here we are, and he did warn us at the time. I remember a lot of his warnings. Just wish in this interview he would have spoken about the current Bank of England's actions regarding interest rate rises and what he would do differently. Branded as the architect of Project Fear, Mr. Carney repeatedly claimed that the economic consequences of Brexit were all negative. He claimed unemployment would rise under anything except a close relationship with Brussels after Brexit. He was wrong about unemployment. That could still happen though. There was a lot of quantitative easing due to COVID, and the UK is narrowingly avoiding a recession. But given that the Bank of England are trying to engineer a recession, we're probably going to head into one, and I think we'll see unemployment at that point. We also need to know if he was basing his analysis on a no-deal Brexit rather than the one we have now, which we have an FTA. And obviously, COVID played a large part in keeping where the economy went. But he's right that everything so far is negative, and it was always going to be that way. It didn't take a genius like him to figure it out. In an interview with The Telegraph, he said, quote, "There's no joy in saying, well, we told you so, because people are having to live with the reality," end quote. In 2018, Mr. Carney published a report alongside his colleague with doom-laden predictions, including a no-deal scenario that would trigger up to a 30% drop in house prices and a recession more damaging than the financial crisis. A no-deal situation would have meant that we would have to put tariffs on all EU goods coming into the country, which would have spiked inflation massively. I don't think anyone would have predicted the UK doing minimal checks, and I mean absolutely minimal checks on EU goods in order to stop food scarcity and even higher food inflation. Food inflation which hit nearly 20% increase this year. Could you imagine what it had been with tariffs, let alone the basic checks we were meant to be doing? I think that figure would have been over double. Carney, who led the Bank of England for 7 years until 2020, said a series of, quote, negative supply shocks, end quote, had disrupted the economy and led to an unexpected increase in costs. He said the single biggest energy shock since the 1970s, combined with a shrinking workforce and the impact of Brexit, had triggered a unique adjustment in the UK that he suggested could take years to unwind. And can someone please tell me what the hell was going on in the 1970s? I've tried to read up on it, but boy, it just sounds like a nightmare. And I think it will take a lot longer, than just a few years. I guess it's saying a few years to unwind potentially, but I think it'll be a lot longer than that. It'll probably take a decade, depending on what the next government does. It took us nearly a decade to recover from the '08 crash. This current mess will take a long time to recover from, no doubt. Our export success is capped because of all of the export paperwork. Imports have gone up dramatically as well due to the paperwork and other checks. That will only increase with the further checks the Tories have to implement. Further import checks and that UK CA mark will cause havoc if we go through with the CA mark. Had the UK done full import checks, prices and shortages would have been way higher than they are. Forget the around 20% we saw. Vet checks and physical inspections are no joke. This is what Carney could have factored into his analysis. Not to forget the staffing cost. The amount of customs officers you would need would have been ridiculous. Remember Gove was like, we'd need 50,000, and what's the cost of that? What would be the cost of 50,000 custom officers, along with the vets and the other facilities we would need? Carney said, quote, "We laid out in advance of Brexit that this will be a negative supply shock for a period of time, and consequences of that would be a weaker pound, higher inflation, weaker growth, and the central bank would need to lean against that." And that's exactly what happened. It's happened in coincidence with other factors, but it is a unique aspect of the economic adjustment that's going on here, end quote. And he's right that it's unique to the UK because we're the only country that left their major trading bloc. That's why the UK will struggle against the G7 members. But before you shout Germany, Germany recovered from the pandemic and are looking at a slight dip. We have still not reached pre-pandemic levels and celebrating 0% growth, i.e. celebrating stagnation. That's the difference between us two. Germany are still in a better economic position, and we potentially are still heading into a recession. We're not out of the woods yet. Carney's intervention comes of Rishi Sunak, battles to half inflation this year, except he's not doing anything to half inflation. Food prices are rising at their fastest in 45 years. Wage growth remains strong. It's not that high, I'll be honest. And stubborn inflation has triggered chaos in the mortgage market amid investor bets that interest rates will have to rise from 4.5% to 5.75% to bring down inflation. That's over a 1% increase. That's nuts. I think there was a more interest rate increase recently. To be fair, the inflation number the CPI has is bogus because it does not account for mortgages, rent. It does account for energy. It does not. It does not account for mortgages or rent. Those are some of the highest things that people have to pay. And those are some of the things that have increased the most. Also, we don't know what the basket of goods are. What they look at to calculate CPI either. That's the other problem. They hit the average person the most along with food. Even the way CPI is calculated, the basket of goods is not made public. Might as well say crime has gone down and just omit the non-violent crime figures that the Tories did recently, I think. Sunak, even if by miracle can get the inflation rate down to about half, or even have halved it, people are still paying more for goods. That they'll notice that, rather than a 10% increase on goods now, if we see a 5% increase in goods now, people still feel the 5%. It's not a win. That's the problem. Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, has said the UK has, quote, no alternative but to raise the interest rates to keep a lid on prices. Britain is not the only country with high inflation. Germany has the slowest. Germany, which is predicted by the IMF to have the slowest growth in the G7 this year, saw prices rise by 6% in the year to May, while inflation in Italy stood at 8%, slightly lower than the UK's headline of 8.7%. And again, comparing to Germany makes no sense, given that their recovery was better than ours initially. So it's a bit of a cherry-pick figure. Also, there are still a lot more members of the G7, by the way. It's not just Germany. It's not everyday Germany. You still have France, I think, which is a more comparable nation. They're not facing the same problems we're facing. It's just cherry picking. We also don't know how these other countries calculate their figures. Do they include energy and mortgages into their kind of CPI calculations? I don't know. I think CPI is meant to be standardized, but if we're all looking at a similar basket of goods, or at least the most essential items that people buy, is that what Italy and Germany are doing versus us? Because we know the UK figure is bogus. Carney described Brexiteers as, quote, a group of people who portrayed it as being something that was going to be seamless and positive and driving growth, end quote. He said these views could be contrasted with those of the bank and other technocrats who based analysis that was skeptical of that, which that's underplaying it a lot. They tried to state out the facts as best they could, and he's not wrong. They said we would not leave the single market. That's what Daniel Hannan said and Owen Paterson said. We would basically have the best bits of the EU without the financial contributions and be able to make deals with other countries. They sold people snake oil, telling them we would be like Norway or Switzerland without explaining what they would mean. Once they won the vote, they said we can't be like Norway or Switzerland because they have to accept EU rules without a say. So they flipped it immediately. He said the negative outcome had, quote, proven to be the case. End quote. Despite Mr. Carney's repeated insistence about the risks of Brexit, the jobs market has remained resilient, with the unemployment rate remaining close to its lowest since the 1970s. Again, unemployment is probably the one he got wrong here, but the Bank of England looking to engineer a recession, we could see unemployment rise dramatically. A series of former cabinet ministers also dismissed Mr. Carney's claims. Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg, the former business secretary, described Mr. Carney's criticisms of Brexit as obviously nonsense, instead of blaming the bank's failures of exacerbating Britain's cost of living crisis. Moggy said, quote, he uses dodgy figures, he is responsible for many of the failures of the Bank of England, he was a bad governor who politicised the bank and presided over failures in forecasting and failures to begin the process of reversing quantitative easing when the economy was strong, end quote, said Moggy. I would have asked Mogg what the correct figures are then and whose statistics we should be using. Because we have comically high inflation along with other major issues. Will Moggy provide evidence of the true numbers here? And also, he's blaming Carney for a lot of the problems we have now. The problems that we have now isn't down to the Bank of England predominantly. The interest rates are, but the main problems we have are the Conservative Party. Let's be honest now. Moggy had previously accused Mr. Carney of leading Project Hysteria, following the governor's predictions of a possible recession and soaring unemployment that he had claimed to be triggered by voting to leave the EU. Once again, Carney was right on most things, and we see more and more of the Brexit impacts kicking in, and other European countries recovering. Who are you going to blame at this point? When these countries continue to recover and we're stuck where we are celebrating 0% growth. Dame Andrea Leadsom, another former business secretary, added, quote, "I do not agree that inflation is caused by Brexit. Inflation is a massive problem around the world. The spikes in energy prices are a massive problem caused by Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine and is not unique to the UK. You can certainly argue supply chains were broken by the COVID pandemic, and that made it harder following Brexit to recover. But to say it's all the fault of Brexit is just nonsense," end quote. And she straw man Carney because he said, as mentioned before, he said, quote, "We laid out in advance of Brexit that there will be a negative supply shock for a period of time, and the consequences of that will be a weaker pound, higher inflation, and weaker growth. Ellipses. Now that's exactly what's happened. It's happened in coincidence with other factors," end quote. He's not saying Brexit is the only factor here. He's saying it's a major factor, and it's not even been fully implemented yet. I'm again talking about the import checks, but when we compare to other countries, the UK is still doing worse. And the fact is, we are paying the highest energy prices in the world. You can't blame Vladimir Putin for that, because we weren't relying on the Russians for energy, not as much compared to Italy or Germany. Yet Germans and Italians are paying less for their energy than we are. It doesn't make sense. This is Andrea Leadsom, the one who quizzed the former head of the IMF, Pascal Lamy, and pretended she knew more about the IMF than the former head of the IMF, Pascal Lamy. And that's one of the most stupid things I've ever seen on TV. You have an expert who worked in the field, who ran the organisation, versus some jobber who had no idea what she was talking about, and yet they were treated as equals. Makes absolutely no sense. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.